A while back, Konami published a Metal Gear Pipeline video covering the latest updates for all things Metal Gear, including the most recent Metal Gear Solid Master Collection Volume 1 patch notes, a soft confirmation that Volume 2 is coming sometime in the future, and they even gave us a peek at the Metal Gear Solid Delta title screen. All of this is great news and it gets me hyped for the rest of the year, but something else was mentioned that caught my attention. Noriaka Okamura, who is a Konami veteran that has worked on many titles with Kojima over the years, was asked if a brand new Metal Gear game separate from Metal Gear Solid Delta was in the works. He stated, quote, "First of all, we'll make Delta properly, and then we'll get feedback from users who say, maybe we should make the next remake, or maybe with this team, it might be okay to make a new game," end quote. This is direct confirmation that Konami is willing to take a risk and make a brand new Metal Gear if Delta is well received and if fans express that they want a new entry over another remake. This got me thinking about the possibilities after Delta releases. What are the games most likely to get a remake next? What would a hypothetical Metal Gear Solid 6 entail? And what would most fans like to see made next? Well, in this video, we're going to answer those questions together. Keep in mind there will be spoilers for the series, so if you're new and haven't played through most of the Metal Gear games, you have been warned. Let's get into it. As the genesis of the entire series, it should be no real surprise that the oldest games in the Metal Gear franchise could use a facelift. Neither of these games are bad by any means, however Metal Gear 1 specifically suffers from very antiquated video game design. Unless you know the game very well, it's gonna be hard to progress through the game intuitively without the use of a guide. There are key items needed to progress that are scattered throughout the game with no real way to figure out their locations. Items such as the gas mask, which allows you to safely walk into rooms and areas that are otherwise deadly. If that wasn't enough, the game also features 8 cards that act as keys and must be collected in order to progress. The doors these key cards open are not labeled, so if you do not know which card opens which door, you'll have to sit there trying each one. This type of gameplay just doesn't cut it by today's standards. Metal Gear 1 is also very light in regard to its story. The Outer Heaven Uprising is a well-known period in the Metal Gear timeline, especially after the Phantom Pain's release in popularity. However, not much takes place in the game that actually covers this era. You can boil Metal Gear 1's story down to Solid Snake making contact with a captured Gray Fox, and then proceeding to destroy Metal Gear TX-55 with the help of his commander, the person we believed at the time to be Big Boss. Turns out this Big Boss is actually Venom Snake, who is also the leader of Outer Heaven and the final boss of Metal Gear 1. Now that summary is obviously a super condensed version of Metal Gear 1's story, but there really isn't much more to it, which gives Konami a bit of leeway and freedom if they choose to remake this particular game. Even with rewrites and fleshing out the story a bit more, I don't think there's enough meat in this game to warrant a remake for it on its own, which is why I personally would like to see a remake of both Metal Gear 1 and Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake combined into a singular experience. Think of Metal Gear 1 as the ground zeros to Metal Gear 2's The Phantom Pain. Metal Gear 1 would serve as the prologue and a way to acclimate players to any new mechanics introduced in these hypothetical remakes, and it would conclude with a 4-year time skip at the end of the Outer Heaven Uprising that leads directly into the Zanzibar land disturbance. It would be amazing to see a cutscene of the real Big Boss pick up the pieces after NATO destroys Outer Heaven. It could show him rescuing the survivors of the bombing and establishing Zanzibar land together with those same survivors. Metal Gear 2, on the other hand, has much more story and substance to it, so following the already established story beats would be a good idea. Metal Gear 2 has always been an amazing game that sadly most fans skip due to its age and appearance. Remaking Metal Gear 2 fully voice acted and with graphics up to today's standards would be an incredible way to get new fans, or even those who skipped out on the MSX games, to play them with all the amenities you get from a modern gaming experience. There are so many memorable moments that take place during the Zanzibar land disturbance. All of the awesome boss fights that were the blueprint to well-known and iconic moments in the MGS games, funny gameplay moments like following the soldier in the Green Beret through the Lost Woods and to the location of Dr. Madnar, getting to actually experience moments mentioned in Metal Gear Solid, like the first fistfight between Solid Snake and Gray Fox, and of course the epic encounter between Snake and Big Boss, where you need to scrap together makeshift weapons while avoiding Big Boss's onslaught of attacks. Just imagining the things they could do to this game in a modern video game engine and with modern graphics and also gameplay from this century makes me super excited. I think Konami would be wise to consider remaking both of these games and making them one epic experience. Call it Metal Gear Solid 0 or something, since these games take place before Metal Gear Solid 1. It would also be pretty cool to play these games right after Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain, since that game actually sheds a bit more light on who we're actually dealing with in Metal Gear 1 and subsequently in Metal Gear 2. Speaking of The Phantom Pain, as much as I love that game, I don't really want to see these hypothetical remakes take on an open world format. The Phantom Pain was a great first attempt at an open world Metal Gear Solid, but I think Metal Gear just lends itself better to more linear progression and storytelling. Keeping things a bit more confined would also help players progress through Metal Gear 1 a bit easier. I like having to find key items during an infiltration mission that help complete said mission, but as stated earlier, some of the items you need are in weird places you wouldn't really intuitively think of looking. This can easily be alleviated in a remake, and apart from prettying the game up, it's one of the most important aspects of these games that needs to be improved for a more streamlined and fun experience. Remaking Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake would be a smart route for Konami to take after Delta. These are probably two of the most skipped games by even hardcore fans of the series, despite them being mainline entries and extremely important to the overall lore of Metal Gear. Completely reimagined environments, fully voice-acted cutscenes, and a complete gameplay overhaul are what these games desperately need, and I have no doubt in my mind that if done correctly, these games could fully realize their potential and satisfy newcomers to the series as well as longtime fans. They provide Konami with the blueprints of great games, but also allows them to flex their creative muscles and take some liberties in the process of bringing these 30-year-old games up to today's standards. Despite already having a remake, which we'll get into in just a second, browse any sort of Metal Gear community where remakes for the series are being discussed, and one of the main games on everyone's mind is the first Metal Gear Solid. Now, I'm obviously biased as the first Metal Gear Solid is one of my favorite games of all time, but I truly do believe this game holds up even by today's standards, at least in regard to its story and the way the game is presented. Hell, even the voice acting holds up in my opinion. Where the game suffers in the eyes of many, and especially in the eyes of newcomers to the series, are in its graphics and its gameplay. Again, I am extremely biased and have played Metal Gear Solid 1 for thousands upon thousands of hours, but if I try to be as unbiased as I can possibly be, I do see how the gameplay can be considered a bit rough in a lot of regards. Not being able to aim down sights or turn the camera with the right analog stick is enough to turn most gamers off from ever completing Metal Gear Solid. This is especially true for those who didn't grow up with the series and are just now getting into it. There was an attempt to fix some of these common complaints in the aforementioned remake of Metal Gear Solid, the Twin Snakes. The Twin Snakes was created on the same engine used to create Metal Gear Solid 2, which made for a more graphically impressive game at the time and also updated the gameplay to be more in line with that of Metal Gear Solid 2. Most notably, the Twin Snakes added changes such as a non-lethal pistol to Metal Gear Solid and the ability to aim down weapon sights in first-person view. Certain expanded combat mechanics introduced in Metal Gear Solid 2, such as holding enemies up and rolling, were also possible in the Twin Snakes. On paper, these changes seem like they would remedy all of the complaints people had about the controls for the original Metal Gear Solid. However, due to map layouts staying the same and boss mechanics not being changed in order to accommodate these new mechanics, the game was made entirely way too easy compared to the original, and some iconic boss encounters, such as the Ocelot boss fight, were made borderline comical. Apart from its gameplay blunders, the Twin Snakes also suffered from some pretty gnarly looking character models, a downgrade in the voice acting department, and over-the-top recreations of beloved cutscenes. If all of that wasn't enough, the fact that it was a Nintendo GameCube exclusive pretty much guaranteed that the Twin Snakes would not be a popular remake of MGS1 with most fans. All of that being said, the Twin Snakes did include some quality of life additions that I personally think Konami should keep in mind if they decide to remake Metal Gear Solid. One of my favorite examples has to be the changes to the way you heat up or cool down the PAL key toward the end of the game. Instead of backtracking to the freezer room and then the boiler room like in MGS1, you can instead use the pipes found within the PAL key room itself to get the job done. Of course, the option to do it the old school way should remain, as giving the player more choices to do something is always a good thing. Shadow Moses itself would have to be completely reimagined and recreated from the ground up while keeping the player's ability to aim down sights and move the camera around in mind. The closest attempt we've gotten to a faithful recreation of Shadow Moses is the version of Shadow Moses in Metal Gear Solid 4. And as much as a nostalgia bomb as that was, it still wasn't perfect. Portions of Shadow Moses were changed in order to funnel players into the route they are meant to take in order to progress, and perhaps the biggest misstep in MGS4's version of Shadow Moses is the fact that there are no human enemies or guards for 95% of this chapter. It makes the whole thing feel a bit hollow or like a cheap imitation, which is the same exact issue most have with the Twin Snakes. Konami has the potential to right a wrong, so to speak, by making a Metal Gear Solid remake that is faithful to the original while also incorporating some of the quality of life changes the Twin Snakes introduced. Despite the original Metal Gear Solid being 25 years old at this point, it is still one of the games that I personally feel evokes a certain indescribable mood. Perhaps that's due to the hardware limitations of the time and the way that those same limitations force you to use your imagination. Either way, the task of balancing what made the original so special and keeping that intact while also updating and modernizing the game is a difficult task, but it's not an impossible one. It's also one that Konami inevitably needs to tackle, as the original Metal Gear Solid is one of the most legendary video games of all time and one that deserves a good remake. Moving away from all the remake talk, as stated at the very beginning of the video, it has now been directly confirmed by someone very involved with the Metal Gear IP at Konami that new entries to the series are a possibility if we, the fans, feel like Delta was a success and are willing to trust the current team behind Metal Gear with a brand new game. While I honestly think the most likely scenario after Delta will end up being another remake, it's fun to speculate what the next brand new Metal Gear entry might look like. There are so many possibilities, but for the sake of all of you watching the video, I'll narrow my personal wish list down to just 2 games. The first is a game set in between Metal Gear Solid 2 and Metal Gear Solid 4 with Raiden as its protagonist. The game would explain what exactly happened to Raiden that turned him into the cyborg ninja we all know and love by the time we see him in MGS4. For those that have been following Metal Gear for a while, you'll know the game I'm describing was supposed to be Metal Gear Solid Rising before it became Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. Recently, thanks to a Did You Know Gaming video, we have more details on this cancelled project. If you want to see the whole video, it'll be linked in the description, but I want to focus on the details that describe what Metal Gear Solid Rising was originally supposed to be. As the Did You Know Gaming video explains, Metal Gear Solid Rising told the story of Raiden keeping true to the promise he made to Olga at the end of Metal Gear Solid 2. The main plot of the game would entail Raiden rescuing Sonny from a character named Wexler who was holding Sonny captive at a top-secret military facility. Raiden would succeed at getting Sonny out, but would end up getting captured himself. During his captivity, his body and face would be completely destroyed and replaced with cyborg components. It was also planned to have Raiden forget his memories during this time and actually work under Wexler while his memories were being suppressed. It is only up until a boss fight with a psychic, who appears to Raiden as Solid Snake, that Raiden manages to get his memories back and breaks free from his mental imprisonment. He is able to escape the facility, but in the process, his black suit is damaged. This is when he seeks the help of Dr. Petrovich Madnar, and his iconic white suit, the same suit he dons in Metal Gear Solid 4 and the beginning of Rising, is created. Exact details of how the game ends are unknown, but just from that brief summary, the game sounds exactly like something I would want to experience. As much as I like how Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance turned out, I was devastated when Metal Gear Solid Rising was cancelled. Raiden rescuing Sonny from the Patriots and losing his human body in the process has always been close to the top of my Metal Gear game wishlist. Hopefully the story is being discussed at Konami as a possibility for a future game. Lastly, we have an idea for a game that Kojima himself was toying with in his mind. This game would focus on the boss during the events of World War II. It would be a first-person shooter similar to something like Wolfenstein, and it would focus on the boss as she forms the Cobra unit and serves her country. We would also potentially see the beginning of her mentoring a young Jack, the man we all know as Naked Snake, and eventually Big Boss. More insight and background on the boss is something I have always wanted. She is easily one of the most legendary and iconic characters in the entire series, which means if this game is made, it needs to be handled with a lot of love and care. The game would span from the beginning of World War II all the way up until the moment the boss is forced to kill the Sorrow to complete her mission. Everything else is up to Konami to write and fill in the gaps for us with a meaningful story and fun gameplay. Being able to take control of the boss and experience the story of how she became such a legendary soldier would be incredible. And from a gameplay perspective, the change of genre to a first-person shooter would be a breath of fresh air for the series. Those, in my opinion, would be the most likely scenarios for what we'll get out of Metal Gear Next, as well as some ideas from the past and from my own personal wish list. Konami has implied that we have the power to decide where they take Metal Gear Next, and while Delta is still quite a ways away, it'll be here before you know it. Hopefully it turns out well, and hopefully Konami sticks to their word and listens to what we have to say. Let me know where you would want Metal Gear to go after Delta. Do you want a new entry to the series, a spin-off, or do you think Konami should just stick to remaking the games for now? Let me know in the comments below. And speaking of Delta, I made a video going over why I personally think starting with a Metal Gear Solid 3 remake is the smartest route to take. You can watch that video here. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.